Hello, everyone. Today we're joined by another CISO in our fireside chats when we talk about AI and security. Of course, we have Paolo, our trusted GRC person as well. But I would like to welcome Steve Zelensky. Steve, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, yes. Pleasure to be here. Steve Zelensky, former CISO, Levi Strauss, and been in the security industry for 25 years and now an advisor.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve, and really look forward to our discussion about AI in security. And before we start, what is your take on the AI? Because there are kind of two camps. One is talking about the Terminator coming, Skynet has been activated, the world is coming to the end. Whereas the other camp is, oh, AI is going to solve all of our problems. We're just going to sit somewhere on the beach, sip margarita, and just do nothing.
Okay, so if I think about it, which is how can it do evil? Okay, Skynet and fear, uncertainty, and doubt is the way that we characterize the problem to get more money for security, right? I would call that old school. If I look at the other way, which was how is AI creating the opportunity to sell more genes? And what is our obligation from a security perspective to manage the negative risks of the business using AI to go faster? And I go, that's the way I look at it. So as opposed to it's Skynet or we're out of work, how about the humans are adapting and we have a new set of toys that we've yet to figure out how to make tools. And in doing that, some jobs are going to go away, others potentially are going to be created, and others are simply going to be done different ways. No different than the Industrial Revolution
Yes.
did for farming. And so we kind of have to just be smart about the journey.
Yeah. I like that. That's kind of the optimistic approach. We're going to do things, but it's going to be more interesting things because we have a better collaborator, assistant, co-worker that is helping us. Um, if you look at kind of security and what are the obvious, the first kind of a order of things that AI could help us with?
There are two areas, if I look at security controls, that jump out to me based on my experience. The first is GRC. And it's all the compliance paperwork that's generated, evidence of compliance to meet frameworks.
Yes.
Much of that is manual labor. It's not automated. It's difficult to automate. We struggle with that. So we have humans doing repetitive tasks and we do them not often enough to get good at them. Okay. So I go, GRC is an area where we can feed AI, and I mean the larger AI, a whole lot of information and have it come out with much more dynamic ways of measuring our current risk or our current posture. So I go, there's one. Okay. We can be more efficient, but we can also be more effective. The other area is the SOC.
Oh, yes.
And that turns out to be much more problematic because whereas GRC, we all realize is just a cost of doing business, and yet we'd like it to be more than just a cost of doing business. The SOC, from a return on investment, is the Achilles heel of security. We do it because we're mandated to do it, but we're all frustrated with how inefficient it is, but more interestingly, how ineffective it is in being able to stop attack. And so you've got a lot of resources that are working hard, but aren't really doing something that I can measure against my effectiveness. So I see AI coming in initially to augment folks like level 1 and level 2 analysts to be able to take the drudgery out of finding more needles.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to see. But over time, what you're going to see with agentic AI is that they're going to look at that data and find not more needles, but the right needles that characterize an attack, not just an incident.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's scaring a lot of people because their jobs are going to go away. But I'll say, but fundamentally, finding what happened just doesn't work. We have to be able to monitor what's happening and look at thwarting the attack versus identifying the damage of a prior attack.
You're kind of you're highlighting two common themes here. In both cases, we have work that is monotonous, boring, but has to be done, whether in the SOC or in the GRC space. And in a way, that may be the perfect option for AI because AI works well with large amounts of data that requires drudgery and kind of going through it because we just have to do it in hope to find something small. And that is kind of the first order, which is AI is going to help us manage the work. So it gives us more capacity. Let's be honest with it. We're going to be able to catch up on things and maybe even do more things. But inevitably, that more capacity is going to lead us to some qualitative leap. So it's not just doing more work, but doing the work differently. So you kind of started talking about the SOC, how if we employ AI initially, yeah, we're going to be able to look at all the data, but at some point we'll start looking at the right data. So let's take it to the next level, both in SOC and in the GRC, and say, okay, let's assume that we have this additional capacity, a lot of additional capacity. How do you think that's going to change the way we do SOC and the way we do GRC?
Yeah. So let's take SOC first, because I think that has, excuse me, the larger opportunity. First thing I'll say is, what is AI? Because now what we have to do is we have to characterize what I would consider the 4 different types of AI that we're putting into play to understand how the maturation of quote AI is opening new opportunities. So I go, AI from our perspective, there's 4 types. There's the AI that does correlation. Okay. It can absorb large amounts of data and identify unique things.
Yeah.
I'm just going to call them unique things that is probably beyond a human to be able to do. And that's what the data scientists have been doing for whole bunches of years in the business, right? Take a bunch of data and be able to look at trends that you can't otherwise see. Well, that's great from a SOC perspective. The second thing it can do is it can make a decision. I have run books. I can train it on the run books that given what it's seeing, it can make a decision.
And explain it to
Okay.
us, give us the reasoning why it came there. Yeah.
Okay, right. Because the run book characterizes the process, and we look at the run book and we get the outcome. Then there's generative AI. Generative AI tells a story. Okay, so if you run the run book, Gen AI can customize the specifics of why the run book was run for people to understand what happened, because we're always doing incident reports. So it's great at being able to tell a compelling story, to be able to characterize that. But then there's the 4th part. And the 4th part is what I would call the agentic AI. What it's doing now is attempting to reason. It's generating knowledge. And then through the CI/CD pipeline, it's moving through all of those things to be able to not just spit out an answer or tell a compelling story or observe a set of correlation, but it's taking the velocity of the data that's coming in. It's taking the breadth of the data that it can see. It's taking the fact that it can find unique things. And then based on that, go back into a feedback loop. And that's the reasoning. And what I call that is the difference between playing checkers, which is decision making, and playing chess, which is using repetitive inferential capability to play the long game to get to what the win is without actually understanding all of the steps. And so this agentic AI and these ability to create virtual digital humans that have been characterized to do certain things and let them go into the feedback loops, that's critical. What's going to happen there, just like when a human plays chess against a machine, and then a machine plays chess against the machine, we're going to potentially learn new ways to win at chess. Well, now what's going to happen here is everything we've done for 30 years in running the SOC is going to go into the model, but then we're going to be able to see different ways that we can play chess to get a better outcome, because we're teaching it to win against identifying an attack versus teaching it to win to find an old attack. And so that is the recharacterization, where I say the evolution of what we're doing is changing because AI in its different components has reached a state that we can have it do things in a way that we won't necessarily trust the output, but we can delay the time that we have to put eyes on glass and let the machine move much further and much quicker to thwart an attack rather than just identify a potential attack.
That is super interesting because if I come to think about it, let's say in the GRC space, if you remember 30, 35 years ago, we were using Excel and Word documents, and then came systems like that allowed us to really categorize and link those documents and give us the workflow, which is more or less automation of the manual work. But it was the same type of work, right? Don't get me wrong, it was super helpful. I mean, I was super happy to get out of the Word in Excel. But since then, not much has changed. I mean, those systems kind of grew up. We can handle more frameworks more easily, but still, it's a workflow that you have to go through, and you have to create certain documents, and you have to manage these documents, and it's the same drudgery. Just we do it more of the same thing. We haven't really changed qualitatively how we do the work.
Yep. And then add on that, which is, if you think about it, we're now creating this concept of, I'm looking through my notes here where I was just talking about it, AI labor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. AI becomes a laborer.
Yes.
And that is that unique concept of, am I using AI to augment a human by letting the individual ask questions or having it feed, or is the AI labor making decisions and then we're augmenting it with a human at the point that the AI labor tells us to do something, or it's stuck and it needs a human in order for it to be able to continue to be able to chase down a potential threat or a potential incident. Okay. So this concept of AI labor is what you're talking about, and these models that we're creating to be able to create a virtual level 1 SOC analyst or a virtual level 2 SOC analyst.
Yeah.
Well, how do I characterize that AI labor? Does it have accountability if it's wrong, and liability with regards to me as a CISO buying those things and using them or training those things? And how far can I go? Because we may simply say it is unacceptable to let it do things that it can do, but from a societal perspective, it's a path too fast.
Right.
And therefore, we won't let it do things. So this is why when this AI labor comes in, now you start to have all of these other considerations come in, not with regards to how fast can it solve the technical problem, but if I look at people and process, right, and societal concerns around trust, right, and responsibility and accountability and jobs, right, like when unions come in, I can see there's going to be, and you see it now, a whole bunch of concern that can't be characterized in specific instances, but as an overarching issue, people just don't trust. And so how do we earn the trust with this AI labor as it inevitably changes the way that from a security perspective, we modify the practice of security for what we knew to do for 30 years versus what we're going to have to do based on speed and agility of how AI is being weaponized. And then second, for you and I, George, how does the profession of a CISO change
Yes.
now that it's emerging as having business responsibility, not just security accountability? What does that look like? How do we establish a practice? What's good enough security versus staying above the security poverty line? So we're being forced to rethink not our traditional maturity models, but how we can establish the business risk profile so that we're allowed to spend the money to address the business risk versus simply inflict friction on business processes because we're afraid that we could have an incident.
Exactly.
That's the transition.
Exactly. You're bringing so many things. And I would like to get back to how AI is going to affect the CISO role, because just a couple of weeks ago, I was on a panel and we were talking about the transition from purely technical role to expand to include more business risk role. Because when you talk to the board, they don't really understand log-J or something like that. You have to translate this into, okay, what is my business exposure here and how do I manage that risk? How do I understand and manage it? But before we go there, you mentioned something which is profound. How do we think about AI? What is our frame of reference? Because in a way, the initial thought was, oh yeah, that's just another tool. That's just another app, which is really very powerful, but it's just another app. Whereas there is the other school of thought, which is maybe you should think of it as a junior member of your team. You should treat it more of a part of your team. And if you take that frame of reference, then a lot of other things follow through. For example, one of the issues with thinking of it as a tool is that, as opposed to the tool, it's learning what it is from the interactions with you. And in fact, in order to be able to gain more value from the AI, you have to train it the similar way how you train a junior member of your team. The other issue that is directly related to us is in terms of access control, because there is a difference whether you give access to a person or you give access to a tool, to a system, to the data, and how often you do it and all those kind of things. So the frame of reference that we use for AI is super important about how we work with it, but also how we secure it.
So here's Steve's simple way of translating what you said, or the way I struggle with it, which was when I talk about playing checkers and playing chess, right? This is, as an engineer, trying to characterize the system. And so if I'm playing checkers, that is a deterministic
Yes.
outcome. If I play checkers, I know every move, and at worst, I can get a draw every time. Okay. And a lot of our workbooks are deterministic systems.
Yes.
When you play chess, that's non-deterministic. The number of permutations of options based on play is larger than my ability to guarantee every move every time. So it becomes inferential, right? We're
Yep.
looking at a set of plays, we got a set of rules, heuristics, and we play and we adapt. Okay. So I was thinking about it as well. The problem with AI is as soon as we talk about it being non-deterministic, everybody says, whoa, how do I know then that I can trust it? How do I know it's not making a mistake? How do I know that it hasn't been maliciously manipulated? And we go down those conversations. Okay. Well, I had a conversation last week with another individual who was very thoughtful. And he said, Steve, the challenge is not deterministic and non-deterministic. It's deterministic and analog. It's now appreciating that what we're trying to do is have it work like the human brain works. Okay. And the human brain and the way the human body works is that lots of data is taken in. Okay. But not everything goes to the brain.
Yes.
If you touch something hot, it's not your brain telling your fingers to get
That's
off.
too slow.
Okay. There, there are different basically checkpoints between fingers and elbows and shoulder that gets to the brain that takes into account immediate response. And some of it goes to the brain. And then the brain cogitates on it and sometimes said, I need more information in the future. So it reaches out to those other points to be able to tell it, I need that as well. That is the analog way of how we think. And so what we need to do is appreciate that AI labor and these different agentic agents is we're trying to now characterize that type of a system as opposed to the big brain where everything goes in and the brain determines and tells everybody else what to do. Okay. That was an aha moment for me as you and I talking about this to go, yes. And now you're seeing the CI/CD pipelines. You're seeing the ability to create these different types of AIs that are able to make decisions within themselves or to work further up the chain and then have feedback loops. And you have different decision-making tiers that this is a better characterization of how humans think and what we want to try to do there. But it may be a bridge too far where we're going to start with deterministic and non-deterministic, but ultimately what you're seeing is people putting technology in to start to look at the way we think, how we characterize that in ways that the old AI was still central brain and now it doesn't have to.
So it's almost like a bringing in subconscious level and conscious level. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
See, and that was my aha, which was I was thinking deterministic, non-deterministic. I had to go orthogonal. I had to go deterministic analog.
Yeah.
Analog is a whole different definition, right? We're talking about medical terminology.
Yes.
We're talking about the way the brain truly thinks. We're understanding the system, the analog system, and what those feedback looks like. And that to me, I think, is a better way if we're going to have a conversation is to let people understand Skynet versus how the human body works. What are we trying to characterize with this technology? And what are the people and process implications to the technology allowing us to characterize it this way?
And that comes back to your question whether you can trust AI. You can almost make an analogous question when you hire a junior person on your team, and how do you know you trust them? So the same logic, the same approach you take, like you monitor their behavior, you monitor their responses, their reactions, and you slowly build trust the same way you build trust with others, human being.
Now think about if we are willing to accept this, you and I as CISOs, now go back and think about how do you characterize the value proposition of the security organization to the business risk? Where do you spend the money on people and process in your security organization versus where you can augment it with technology and the way you characterize success around the effectiveness it being resilient to withstand attack, as opposed to establishing cybersecurity maturity as an ever increasing
Yes.
bar to try to prevent attack. You and I and others, right, the community at large have now got to think through what that looks like. But ultimately, that is what the business is now expecting of us because they will not pay for security's sake. So how do you have a business risk conversation and how do you recharacterize, right, the next evolution of what a cybersecurity practice looks like and how we as CISOs in the profession of CISO is maturing. So we're going from one of being a tool jockey, right, and a CIO to being a professional, more like a doctor or a lawyer, or a CPA, where the accountability and the responsibility is not just that there's an outage. It's not that we're going to pay a fine
Yeah.
because we didn't do something right. We may have the luxury of being able to wear the black and white suit and be able to visit a federal penitentiary because somebody decided that we lied on our risk posture and we do not understand how to evaluate a risk posture.
Yeah. And for that, we need a lot more for our profession to become science.
Do you feel like with the upcoming development of AI, which would be AGI, actually, there was a study that I was reading through this morning that pundits like Elon Musk and Sam Altman said that AGI is coming around 27 and 28. So I feel like with AI getting smarter as a result, do you feel like that will help the CISO profession or will it deter it further?
If you're an alcoholic, okay, and I say this in a positive way,
Mhm.
the first thing you have to do is acknowledge you're an alcoholic to realize you have to change your behavior. Okay. Now, the way we've been practicing cybersecurity for 30 years, okay, is at some point here, we have to acknowledge that what got us here is not going to keep us here for the next 30 years. Okay. Because the weaponization of AI has basically created a circumstance where our existing security controls are losing effectiveness. And my ability to weaponize AI correspondingly for defense isn't there yet. I can't weaponize it for defense the way they're weaponizing it for offense, which is creating perfect digital identities and just ripping through my social engineering attack frameworks, which is the human is my weakest link, and they've got tiger by the tail to be able to now get that human to be the weakest link much more often versus my ability to go shields up and protect that human. That's why I say we got to be resilient. The MITRE attack framework is not about preventing the attack. It's about watching the attack and realizing we have multiple opportunities to be able to identify an attack before it becomes materially exploitable for my company. Well, the mere fact that I go from vulnerability patching to material exploitability and thwarting an attack is a fundamental change in how we practice security for 30 years. Well, AI for weaponization for offense has accelerated that conversation for us. And we're seeing the consequences now around the business simply saying, we'll pay the ransomware because the cost of a security organization and the friction it's creating against its ability to stop an attack just isn't there. So, how do we rebuild credibility and trust with our executive teams and our lines of business to be able to understand what the future looks like for cybersecurity as the profession and the practice continue to mature? We're teenagers at best, probably 7, 8 year olds, if you think about it, as where we are in the life cycle of growing up. And so, as we go through these stages, you have to acknowledge that. And then you have to be able to be smarter about how we, as cybersecurity practitioners, are understanding that and what the business is and how we recharacterize our capability to either protect our company, secure our company, protect our business, or sell more genes. And so as we recharacterize how CISOs have to think, right, and the technology and the weaponization, this is the journey we're on. This is why it's the hardest possible job and why many CISOs and many in the security field are really struggling is because we're not understanding the fact that we're about to become teenagers and the body is changing and the expectations of the adults, the lines of business are changing on us, and we're working through that.
Do you think that will bring more focus on people security? Like if you're thinking in terms of the triad, people, process, technology. On the technology side, we made great investments, a lot of technology and other new tools and all those kind of things. On the process side, we also have some investment. We have so many frameworks and then controls and policies and all that. But people, what we do training, awareness training, and maybe some certifications. And now suddenly AI is hitting us with deep fakes and all those kind of things. And the human piece is not ready for that.
So this gets back to when I talked about the MITRE ATT&CK framework and identities. We have historically focused on human identities accessing business applications.
Yes, that's the
George,
traditional
you and
model.
okay? And what do? We focused a ton on authentication,
Mhm.
and then we looked at business authorization,
Yes.
role-based access controls.
Yes.
That's what we've done, okay? And if you think about it, we've been pretty good on authentication, but we've been terrible for role-based access controls because the business fights us every step of the way.
Yeah.
And even with authentication, we're good at it. But if you look at identity lifecycle management, we're terrible at that. And so you and I end up with more and more access,
Yes.
right, over time, because we're good at giving it. We're terrible at taking it away because people never want to give anything up once earned.
Yes. And we are afraid that something is
Now,
going to break.
you got it.
Yeah.
Now look at what we're calling non-human identities. Look at all the assets now, APIs themselves, right? Services in the CI/CD pipeline, the actual, assets that are the data centers. All of those things now are identities that, as an identity, have rights to be able to do things that eventually require a human to interact with, but don't necessarily require a human to interact with to make the initial queries. Okay. So what we're also seeing is authentication as a concept is weak again. We've lost it because, George, I don't know it's you anymore. And even if I did, okay, it's authorization. It's not, is it George? Is George at this point in time doing something that seems reasonable for George to do? Continuous real-time authorization is where we've been going for the last 4 or 5 years because we've realized that authentication is just an indicator. It's not an absolute. And authorization as role-based access control has now gone to pure entitlements to a whole set of identities outside of human that we must embrace. And that means implementing, if you think about it, our IAM infrastructure into different levels of the business architecture that we've never had to think about before. And we have to reinvent those controls into those areas and leverage all of this data in business context because I can't trust you. I can only make point in time decisions that what you're doing seems reasonable until it isn't. And that recharacterization, and you look at deep fakes, right? And I go, look at multi-factor authentication. Something I have, something I know, something I am.
Yeah.
Well, you and I are having a conversation with Paolo right now. Okay. The only thing I can relate is I see George, I hear George, and I maybe have a shared secret with George. Well, I can't trust seeing him. I can't trust hearing him. I maybe have a shared secret with him. How do I reestablish a reasonable, right, defensive edge with what deep fakes have done unless I can use AI and continuous authorization based on all of this additional context to determine that you're behaving the way that you normally should, that this is a reasonable thing to do. And I may get it wrong the first time. I may get it wrong the second time, but I'll maybe catch it the third time in the MITRE ATT&CK framework as the bad guys are breaking in and then moving laterally before they do material harm for me to throw them out.
Yeah.
And then I got to start the game again. So that change for resiliency, people think, oh, what resiliency is you acknowledging that you can't get prevention to work and you're doing a terrible job as a CISO. And what I'm saying is prevention can work, but in smaller and smaller cases, resiliency has to be the way that we operate as soon as we get to any reasonable size organization. or now as organizations are using AI and non-human identities as the only way that I can have security sell more genes, let the business play in traffic, and manage from an insurance policy perspective those key areas of material exploitability that I, as the CISO, can take insurance policies against. That is a fundamental positioning change in what the value proposition of a CISO in cybersecurity is for a business organization.
It sounds like there's going to be more evolution towards different ways of verifying certain identities, certain controls, certain sets to make sure that, those MITRE TTPs, techniques, tactics, and protocols are mitigated, right? Because you can, and I was having conversation with George about this too, you can trust, but how do you make sure you verify, right? How do you make sure this is not a deep fake? How do you make sure this is not a identity that has access to our systems that is a false identity, right?
And
Is that
without becoming
accurate?
too paranoid, because that's
Mhm.
the other danger. You become crazy of not trusting anything.
Exactly.
Okay. So where you're going with this, Paolo, is remember I said earlier, is a CISO like a CPA? Is a CISO like a lawyer? Or is a CISO like a doctor?
All of the above.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what you find is a CPA can go to jail because they have to hold accountability to SOX.
Hmm.
Okay. We have a bit of that. You look at a lawyer. Lawyers' accountability is to keep us legal. Okay. They don't care about business practice, but we hire them to make sure that we stay legal. So think about the risk frameworks that we're now held accountable for, and we have to keep a company legal. What's the cybersecurity poverty line? How do we keep you legal? And then what do you do above that? But if you look at doctors, and in particular emergency room doctors, which actually emerged in the 80s, emergency room doctors and trauma doctors didn't exist because it wasn't until we had medical care advanced far enough and the concept of ambulances and getting people to the room, to the emergency room in that miracle hour,
Mhm.
that trauma doctors are very different. Here's why. Here's what George and I do on a continuous basis of being able to do real time analysis. A patient comes in. I have got 10 minutes to look at that patient, to do an evaluation, to determine based on my experience, to determine based on what I know in that 10 minutes, to determine course of treatment. The job is not to make the patient perfect. The job is to keep the patient alive
Stabilize them.
to the point that we can then figure out how well we can put him back, but there's no guarantee we do. And we can be wrong and the patient can die. Okay. That is what we have to do all the time. We're in a war. So, how good can we do that where if we're wrong, we can be sued, so to speak? And part of our day is training, is understanding that. But when you go into an emergency room, those doctors can only work for 12 hours. Those doctors have gone through licensing, and we all understand doctors can't be perfect. And so long as they follow best practice, so long as they demonstrate competence, then they are accountable for that, but not accountable to keep you alive. Well, that's where the cybersecurity practice is kind of going is we're a little bit of a lawyer, we're a little bit of a CPA, we're a whole lot of a trauma doctor, okay? But us now understanding that that's how the larger community is holding us accountable and legal and regulatory requirements. And what the business wants is, that's why I said the practice of cybersecurity, okay, and the evolution of the profession of a CISO. This is what we're talking about is appreciating where it's moving to and where is that licensing body? Where is that appreciation that a CISO is actually a profession and can be held accountable and go to jail against risk profile? How are we starting to establish that so that we know how to move forward as a larger community of not just CISOs, but to work with the legal and regulatory agencies, to work with the fact that the government's going to be coming through? How are we taking control for that? And I want to say we're right on the cusp of that's what's happening, where George and I and many other CISOs, when we get in a room, are struggling with trying to understand the way we've done it isn't working. What is the new way to do that? And who can show us that path forward in a way that the accountability for a risk posture is what we're having to do, not accountability to a compliance framework.
Yeah. And that's a much more difficult conversation because compliance is by definition black and white, so it's easy to understand. Either you do it or you don't do it. Whereas with the risk, you have multiple options, and which one is the optimal options? We have to talk about what is the optimization criteria. Are we looking for the next month or for the next 5 years? And there's so many variables there, which makes it very, very difficult. And I guess going back to the original premise, that's where AI could help us, I guess.
Well, and just think about that, right? Which was when we're emergency room doctors, right?
Yeah.
We now have specialists that come in and draw blood.
Yes.
We have the x-ray people, okay? We have all of those experts in certain aspects that come in. The machines themselves now can do x-rays and based on that, give us preliminary diagnosis. This is where we're going, right? Which was we ultimately are accountable, which leverage the experience with limited time to make good decisions. And we're relying on
Experts.
hundreds and thousands of years of medical history and understanding the human body and leveraging technology to be able to improve the likelihood that if the patient arrives in that miracle hour in the emergency room, that they will survive. They will not necessarily be whole, but they will survive.
Yeah. That is fascinating point of view around the CISO profession. We're becoming like an emergency room doctors. Awesome. In the last few minutes, Paolo, any questions for Steve?
Yeah, how do you feel that the CISO profession will evolve as it continues to work with the internal audit profession?
That's a good one.
Okay. Internal auditors and external auditors. And again, this is my opinion. This is what I know and what I think, and I try to have differentiated that tonight, okay? Auditors are there to make sure that you do what you say what you do. They are not there to evaluate whether that's good enough. They're there to simply evaluate that what you said and what you did match. Okay? Internal and external. The challenge we have is we're good at that. And we will improve the maturity of our organizations if it's there. Or auditors can say, I pass you, but I think you should do more. Fine. It's great that you have an opinion. Okay? Put 50 people in a room, you're going to get 300 opinions. The goal for the CISO is to say what you do what you say, to establish a good enough security practice that you get through the compliance exercise. But now, how do you increase the maturity of your practice to address the effectiveness at managing the attack, as opposed to simply the efficiency of meeting compliance requirements? Well, those auditors cannot have the conversation we just had. That's not how they're measured. They're measured in show me your policies, show me your evidence. If A matches B, check the box, and I'm moving on to the next client. Okay? That's good enough. Now, GRC, as what we also talked about earlier, which was, well, governance, risk, and compliance, when we get to third-party and fourth-party risk, which is less and less of my defensive perimeters within my control, how can I trust what George tells me about his infrastructure, given that he's my SaaS provider of all of my healthcare? He has all that data. How do I trust him? And George is using third party and fourth party to lay his infrastructure down. So how do we trust each other when less and less of us actually have control of the environments that we're obligated to protect? I don't have a good answer for that either. That's where AI for third party and fourth party risk and understanding what your external and your internal controls look like to get more consistent, not annual testing of a pen test or a compliance, but that we as a community now are starting to understand how can we share information that doesn't put our risk profile, personal risk profile at risk, but for the greater good, we all agree that this is what should be done. Okay, doctors share information. Doctors share expertise continuously because the profession says we will protect the profession equally as long as you're demonstrating the right practice. We have to ask ourselves the same question.
That is actually a really good parallel that you're drawing here, because third party and fourth party risk is becoming even more interesting now with the advance of the AI. And probably there is something that we can learn from the medical profession, because to your point, they're sharing practices, they're sharing findings without sharing the identity of the patient. So how can we get there? How can I trust my vendor without the vendor giving me all of their secrets, their logs and other sensitive information? So that is, you know what, Steve? I would love to have you for another call just to talk about that. That would be very interesting.
Sure. All right. And like when you reached out, George, right? My obligation here is all of my experience, all of my knowledge, right? Is the security community as a village
Yes.
has got to do a better job to protect our children, which are all our lines of business. Okay. And for the most part, we haven't been doing the best job because we've been doing too much time telling each other why we're the best adults to raise the children and not focusing on the fact that the bad guys are coming through and getting to our children because we're too busy arguing amongst ourselves that I'm better at this than you. So let's focus on how we support each other, focus on the common enemy, protect our businesses, right? And that's all I'm calling out and simply saying, and in this conversation, we went from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age to the Industrial Revolution, and we're working through that as well. So all of these moving parts being in play means we're having to evolve. We have to be smart about that. And that's all I'm really doing is simply saying, look at different ways of thinking about the problem. What are the right ways that we want to characterize what we're up against? Because all I know is what we're doing right now isn't working. And so, what have I got to lose by simply saying, hey, George, you've been in a barrel and you were challenged to find the corner. And you have been working incredibly hard and running all over that barrel and telling me how hard you're working to try to find that corner. Is there a corner in a barrel, George?
Yeah, there is none. There is none. Yeah.
There is not.
So we're asking the wrong
So if
question
that's
then.
true, so let's change the question. That's all I've been doing right during this call with you is I've been changing the questions. I've been saying, well, here's a barrel that we're in. Let me change the question. Here's another barrel we fell
Yeah.
in. Let's change the question so that we're trying to get up and simply saying, let's acknowledge where we realize that we can continue to work really hard there and it may take the paycheck. We may get a paycheck, but ultimately, are we doing the right thing for the security community, right? To be able to protect our assets. And what do those conversations want to look like? So we're an alcoholic. We've acknowledged that we are. So now how do
Step
we
one.
get together and go forward?
Yes. Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. This was very enlightening. Actually, I have to think a lot about our discussion. There are a lot of layers here. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you,
And
Steve.
likewise, Paolo and George, I appreciate the opportunity to just be able to chat with you, right? Because that's what this was. This was everything we're thinking about how we as a security community and all the CISOs that George and I talked to, where I'm simply saying, look, at this point, my obligation is to pay it forward and pay it back, but it's to be able to challenge myself and the community in the best possible way. And so that is a challenge I take seriously. And so I really appreciate you giving me the airtime to be able to talk about the problems.
Thank you so much. And we'll bring you back for the third and fourth party. That is a very interesting topic. Thank you.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.